Wilcox. I'm Assistant Professor of Architecture here at the Taubman College. First, I'd like to thank our speakers, both present and through Skype, for joining us today. So this session is entitled Digital Publics, and the description is in your program, but I thought I'd paraphrase a little bit to begin. The aim of the session is to explore how information technology alters notions of public space. The very idea of a public has long been associated with media. The internet now recasts such civic principles as presentation of self, participatory market production or self-organization, resource governance, and other things which we saw from a lot of the speakers today. From the start, civic principles have been at the core of internet policy debates, and they have, of course, also been long central to architecture and urbanism. This session rethinks notions of public space and the public sphere and seeks to assess the technological ramifications of the tangible presence of architecture, urbanism, and I would also add to that design in general. So the role of this is to engender more of a conversation and to have a panel which would go back and analyze all the presentations. So my idea for putting together a series of questions is to think of us not simply as users, but creative makers, both involved in the production of technology, but the things which they engender, as well as educators, which many of us are. So my discussion points will be directed at that context. My first question requires a little bit of preface, and the following ones that we get to are much shorter. So on to the future. In Jonathan Zittrain's recent book, aptly named The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, he begins with an anecdote in which he contrasts two products or inventions of Apple founder Steve Jobs. One of which most of us are familiar with, the iPhone, released in 2007, and the other which maybe some of us are familiar with, the Apple II personal computer, which was released some 30 years ago when Jobs was all of 21. Through this comparison, Zittrain constructs the main theme of his book, which is the difference between what he calls generative technologies as opposed to appliance technologies. When one brought home the Apple II computer, as with other personal computers of this generation, plugged it in and turned it on, all one faced was a flashing cursor. The use of the machine demanded that one learn to speak its language and generate content. And only later did software and applications develop, but through an open, generative, and public context in which users were also makers. He points out this moment of history of personal computing also coincides with the eventual growth of the internet, which he also argues is generative, built in a similar public manner. But tools, he goes on to write in the book, like the iPhone and the internet had over time become less generative, less open, and less flexible, more appliance-like. This, I would say, is akin to what Larry Lessig, in his book Remix, calls the development of the read-only culture as opposed to a read-write one, also evoking the ancient adage that one either accepts fish or learns how to fish. So, on to my question, or let's say discussion point. As our technologies have certainly become more usable, robust, and connected, which I think we saw a lot of today, have they in fact become less generative? Is there something inherently public about generative technologies as opposed to prescribed tools? And in light of this, what is at stake in terms of creative practice, but we could also say education? Anyone? Yeah.
I'll take a stab to start. I think at least the tools that I'm most familiar with, which are the ones that are used to help empower design and creation and simulation and analysis are tools that are intended, okay, which is probably the issue at large here, intended to help empower people to make better decisions and more rapidly understand the consequences of the different iterative analysis that they're going through. So the process, as I perceive it, is that though some of the tools are considered to be limiting in terms of their prescriptive methodology of solving problems, or the prescriptive methodology of how we, document buildings and designs and those kinds of things, as they become more and more flexible and more user-friendly, they're intended to empower and not be so prescriptive. I think the tools in their infancy, whether it be the interface that the people use or the way people first adopt them, sometimes can be a little bit too prescriptive. But if you look at any of the design tools that are out in the market right now, some amazing things have come from the result of people thinking outside of the box and using them in ways that weren't even intended by the designers of the tools. And I think whether you look at the appliances and anything out there today, you can see into the future things that we might not have envisioned. I mean, I, for one, look to what iPad version 2 might look like, for example, and see the merger of the gyroscope, which is in the latest version of the iPhone, merging with the camera technologies, merging with digital modeling, and be able to almost go back to the fact that you'll be able to hold up a virtual screen in an environment and walk within a space that doesn't even physically exist yet, and the merger of all those technologies actually be able to let you visualize through that virtual portal what your environment's going to look like at a scale that you can relate to. That's, I think one of the natural enablers. Not sure that fully answers your question, but at least that's a perspective I try to bring to it.
It's a good question. I think in the presentations, one of the kind of interesting questions or things that we could think about that Glenn's question reminds me is that, in a way it's been maybe more fun and maybe easier to talk about the digital part of digital publics than the public part. And there's the kind of rich interplay of digital materiality. But the term public, I think, is not really accelerated by appliance technology or really by generative technologies. Something can be more populous, more people can use it, and they can use it in a slightly greater range of individual ways, but it may not be truly public, or perhaps I'm just thinking of a physical and delimited public. In the same way, I think public isn't really fully captured by the word accessible. If something is accessible, if we can access into a portion of someone's life, does that really make it public? Is that the same as public understood in disciplinary architecture terms? And same too for visible. If we can see it, is it public, or is there some other quality or qualities about public that's still not encompassed by populace? Many people use it. Accessible, any individual can get at it, and visible. And I think that there are. And I would just say also that tools have a discrete, still a kind of discrete object-like character to them. And I think it's really important to distinguish between maybe generative appliances as infrastructure or as kind of really deep code structure that we use, and the fact that the kind of ways in which those systems are organized are really not at all visible. So you might see a tool, you might access it, many people might use it, but actually how that operates in terms of management systems and organization of flows of capital, et cetera, is not really seen. And in that way, it remains kind of resolutely private.
I mean, I think I would say. I don't think you can look at it as a kind of direct linear progression of a kind of, more open idea or an flexible idea of technology to a more appliance technology. I don't think these things evolve in any sort of linear fashion. And certainly there are moments of, I think recently, of technologies that much more, that allow open source. I mean, the whole open source movement, I think, is a means to make even the most inflexible appliance. I mean, I can hack my iPhone, right? And I can jailbreak it, and I can do whatever I want with it. And I think it actually has less to do with the tools themselves than the way we approach them. And I think we have to be the ones to have that shift in the way we think about how we use the technologies.
I would agree with that, even as a user of certain appliances, I'm certain that I use my appliance in a particular way that's distinct from the way in which it's used by my colleagues or my students, and probably in a less sophisticated way, actually, in terms of my iPhone. But I think that what I was trying to present in my 15-minute talk was that the conversation really, I think, isn't about what tools we're using at any given moment, but the ways in which those tools shape the values we hold at that moment and how shifts in tools shift our values. And so I think that whether it's a sort of more closed and pointed appliance-based tool or a generative one, there's still sufficient openness that one has to take a position about how to engage the tool and what to do with it. And in many of the presentations, in a good half, people were really developing their own tools for, obviously, that aligned with values that they held about whether it's engaging the public or being aware of one's carbon footprint or water use or whatever it is. Those are all values that are sort of shaping how we use the devices. And since all of these tools will continue to slip out from under us and be something else tomorrow, the question of how to slow it down to know what to do with them is something that I wonder about.
Larry and Jonathan are both very politically motivated by concerns about the design of technology and the regulation of technology, and I don't think that either of them actually believe the technology is going to become or is becoming less generative, but they're concerned about bumps along the way. In any case, if they do believe that, I think they're wrong. We've enabled access to awareness, to conversation, to exchange, to data, to events and interactions over time, where the temporal web becomes more important than the static web or the current web. And humans take that access and they remix, they create, they generate, they do things. And I really think that we can't put that genie back in the bottle, that universal authorship is with us, and that the ability to remix is not something that Apple can control or that Congress can control, although they have very strong reasons to try to slow it down or to shape it, but they're going to fail. And they have failed. It's really quite wonderful, the democratization of access to each other and to the informed creations of each other, and our ability to transform those and basically be engaged in public performance and universal authorship.
I did have a related question as a follow-up to that, but based on the presentations that so I wanted to get to the question after that, and then if we have time, I'll come back. During the previous conference, The Future of Urbanism, which was held in this very space, there was a session also entitled New Publics or New Public Spaces. And during the discussion session, Saskia Sassen made a distinction that I think is relevant for our topic today. She was fielding a question about the relationship or apparent opposition between physicality and virtuality, and particularly physicality in relation to urban public spaces. Saskia commented that the term matter or material seemed much more appropriate than physical in describing contemporary urban spaces, and that today, she went on to comment that this materiality was always imbricated with the virtual, that there isn't a clear opposition, that one can't divorce the two. So my question is about not only the confluence of these two in whatever forms, whether we agree or disagree with Sassen's statement, but this idea of physical space becoming matter. As architects or designers, do we work on space anymore? Is space our medium, or is space simply the result of working with or on matter in new ways that are engendered by new forms of technology?
I'll jump in first this time, partly because I have nothing to say, so I'll say it quickly. I'm not an architect, and I'm barely a designer, and to the extent that I am, I'm only a virtual designer. So the one observation I want to make is one that was very instructive to me about a decade ago, at a time when people were getting very excited about something that was being called e-commerce, an area in which I worked. But something that occurred to some people earlier than others, and then occurred to most everybody after the dot-com crash, is that e-commerce is commerce, and the fact that some of it is transacted electronically doesn't change anything. I don't think it's going to be very many more years before we stop distinguishing between the physical world and the virtual world. They are the world. There is no virtual world, there is no physical world, they're the world.
I'll jump in. As I've always heard it described, and as an architect, and anybody out there that has the same perspective, you understand, our entire physical manipulation of materials is all about creating this void. I mean, we're about creating the void. We're about creating the negative space that is within everything else. And the experience of what that space feels like, how you experience it, how you live with it, how it's climate controlled, and all of those things. To me, the virtual perspective is somewhat entertainment on one extreme, because it's all about imagination, and on the other extreme is about visualization and prediction and predictability about what the voids are going to look like when they become larger, more realistic, lived-in spaces. I don't separate the two, because I see one as a tool to help you better understand the other. I mean, I think from a social point of view, if everybody stays behind a computer and they never ever experience the physical spaces, then we as a culture and a society are headed in the wrong direction. I think, the worst thing we ever did as a public in the past was segregate functions, segregate what we do in this life between work and play and sports and other things we do to interact with people. And in the U.S., it's been obviously the worst case scenario, whereas the Europeans have always understood that you blend all of these activities into one. The whole idea of the virtual space and a common public space that people can interact more and more on a daily basis is the kind of environments, the kind of voids that we need to create. To me, I look at the virtual side as a means to the end to help me better understand how to create the physical space, to create the voids.
Well, just a quick comment to the we are the world, or this is the world. I mean, I don't I don't disagree that the virtual and the actual are coming together or are already part of the world, a super important part of the world, a part that exerts a lot of power. Internet is certainly a site of information, and so it's extremely valuable. But maybe this is self-evident, so we're not talking about it, but because it's too obvious. But you know, many people, a quarter of the world's population, actually don't have electricity, or they don't have access to electricity, so they don't currently have the internet. So maybe we're already thinking about a kind of future world where everybody is connected and everybody does have a source of energy to affect that connection. But I think that that's something that just needs to be said. Maybe it is very obvious. And yeah, I work with space and I work with public space. I think that working with the occupation of space and working in time are two really important characteristics that are unique to the discipline of architecture. So as an architect, I value them. At the same time, I think that the kind of hybridization that many of us have talked about, the way that materials can be hosts for digital technologies, or the way in which they're taking on attributes of the digital technologies that form them and so forth, are incredibly interesting, as is the communication between surfaces, building skins, the environment, and so forth. So it's really the kind of complex set of conversations that I think is really the most interesting.
I think it's interesting that you, or that Saskia was setting up space or matter as the kind of new space, when in fact space is more intangible to me than matter, which is very tangible. So I'll just sort of start with that thought. But I mean, architects have, I mean, currently I'm more editing a journal than a practicing architect, although I have been practicing or practiced for many, many years. And I mean, architects don't just design space or matter, but it's also you're designing or constructing relationships between people. But I mean, that's even in the most conventional, you know, practices 30 years ago, you're constructing relationships between the owner, the contractor, the engineer, the architect. You're orchestrating those, designing those, if you will, and looking at a lot of really abstract things too. So I think it's a kind of artificial, I'm not necessarily the we are the world, but I do think it's a kind of artificial construct to say that, you know, that there's a kind of physical and a virtual, because all of those, maybe I'll say abstract relationships and abstract things are things we've always designed. I don't think that's a kind of new idea, really.
So I think probably have time for one more question, and this is more related to media. So the question of how has the nature of creative production changed for better or worse through the influx of network technologies. These technologies which foster visibility, publicness, and connection of work and projects, both in process and through a sort of creative exchange, and produced, finally sort of mediatized through imagery, where the speed of dissemination and the immediacy of feedback and critique has rapidly collapsed the space between the conditions of producing and product. Has creative work been thickened, made more meaningful by this exchange, or are we experiencing a global flattening in the field, creating a sort of universalized or default condition?
I can start with that. I'd say that there's definitely the potential for the work to flatten as imagery becomes so easily exchanged without content other than that which the image projects. And I would say that also the way we make determinations about the importance of an authored product in the world is also flattened because there's so much information, so many images. It's very difficult to make judgments and distinguish things. But at the same time, having the availability of kind of open platforms for sharing information, if they're set up with the objective in mind to make it possible to critique and discuss and interrelate forms of research, then I think the internet is such a powerful thing for extending and deepening the kinds of research we do as either software designers or architects or urbanists. One thing that I didn't present today but that I considered presenting was a website that we designed at UCLA for this kind of ongoing conversation about design research, which is called studioplex.org. It's basically a Web 2.0 kind of user generated environment for collecting and presenting design research, which we then sort of sift through twice a year to try to pull out themes in contemporary research and actually draw attention to the relationships between things, what sets that one exhibit apart from the next exhibit. It's almost like a kind of online journal, which is looking at what students and faculty are producing. So I think tools like that could help to give depth and expand our ability to critique the images that we are kind of bombarded with.
Yeah, I agree very much with that, and I think that that in fact these, if properly designed and handled and so forth, that there are really key forums online. There are tutorials, there are blogs, and there are even individual websites that are really useful. And I think that particularly related to fabrication and issues around fabrication, these online locuses are taking on a different position. So now we have like 3 players. There's the online forum, there's academia, and there's practice. And it used to be that, at one point perhaps, as a practitioner, maybe I'm being ridiculously optimistic, but probably at some historical point, I don't know, in a mythological 1940s or 1920s, large professional practitioners like an SOM were probably thought they were probably at the forefront of something, and maybe they were, in terms of the organizational complex and kind of building large buildings and so forth. The difficulty with academia is that how do you then connect with industry, with large-scale forces to take new ideas which can be generated in schools and actually implement them in practice? And so this kind of third party or third player of the forum is actually, I think, accelerating that.
Yeah, I continue to see the democratization of the whole design process. I mean, when you look out there in the whole, I'm going to say the internet-wide perspective of what the different tools are, there are now design tools that will help people do early design assimilation of programs and things like that, with people participating in the thousands all at the same time, helping create functional programs and forums and those kinds of things. And when you look at visualization, you start to see the removal of the barriers that used to be an inhibitor for participation. And it used to be only architects and engineers and people who are really highly trained in understanding how to go through those decision-making processes, being able to make those decisions. And now with visualization and those kinds of tools being much more on the forefront, owners, users of a building, and so many other constituents within the process, the whole network of people involved in that process can now participate actively in that decision-making process. I mean, it's really a unique phenomena to sort of think of group design, but that's what I see evolving. I mean, the architects and the engineers still have to have that purview in terms of, you know, health, safety, and welfare, and there's certain legal responsibilities we're responsible for, but the process is now collaborative. Nobody does this in a vacuum anymore. No one.
Any last comments? Great, thank you very much.